an e4 player, then this particular gambit should definitely be on your bucket list. Besides seeing the northern lights or doing the skydiving. So let's get started. This gambit starts with e4, e5. We play a knight to f3, attacking the e5 pawn. Black will defend it by playing his knight to c6. Now, the gambit that I'm talking about is called as the Scotch Gambit. It starts by when we play a pawn to d4, the queen's pawn 2 squares straight, attacking in the center directly. But in this particular video, I'm going to share with you how you can get into this gambit one move delay. You first play a bishop to c4. The most common move here, what black will do, will definitely play the knight to f6, right? Instead of going for the fried lever attack, going with knight to g5, since there are a lot of defense to it, you go for the Scotch Gambit. You play a pawn to d4. Now here there are three choices what black can do. Either black can capture e takes on d4. He can also capture on d4 square by his knight, or he can take on e4 square with his knight. Correct? Knight takes on d4, knight takes on e4, or e captures on d4. These are the three common choices what black has. Only one is correct out of these three. We are going to have a look at all of these three variations. First, let's get started when knight takes on e4. If knight takes on e4, that fails to, we are going to capture back on e5 with d takes on e5. Now, when he develops normally, playing bishop to c5 square, we have this killer move, queen to d5. Queen d5 gives three threats. Attacks on the f7 square, we are threatening to give a checkmate, giving an attack to the bishop as well as to the knight. We don't need to worry about the knight capturing on the f2 square because then queen f7 will be a checkmate. And we do not need to worry about bishop captures on f2 square too, because even if it's a check, it's just one move. Bishop f2, king e2, defend the check, and now he has to defend the knight as well as the pawn on the f7 square. Let's say he simply castle. You're going to win the knight, and then eventually you would want to capture this bishop as well. Correct? So knight e4 is not a great idea what black should do. Let's have a look at what happens when knight takes on d4 square. So if knight captures on d4, then we have this fantastic sacrifice on the f7 square, taking the advantage with weakness on the f7 square. Play bishop f7, king f7. We are going to go knight g5 or knight e5 check. The king goes back and then you win this knight. Right? So you got your pawn back with an interest also. Now the king will be stuck in the center, won't be able to castle because you have given a check and the king was moved. Right? Okay. So knight e4, we see it fails to that queen d5 move. Knight d4 fails to bishop f7 move. So the only correct response here, what black has, is to capture on d4 with his pawn. Let's say e takes on d4. Then you simply castle. Go for the development. We are doing it in the gambit style, right? So we have sacrificed a pawn in the center. We have attacked in the center. Now you go for a quick development. You castle. So your rook comes in the game immediately. Now, if your opponent captures on the e4 square, thinking this pawn on e5, this pawn will now come to e5, attack the knight, and the knight won't have too many squares to go to. So let's say if he decides to capture on the e4 square with his knight. Now that is also a wrong move. Grandmaster Wesley So has fallen for this trap. I have posted a link in the description box where I've recorded a complete video on that particular game. In this video, I'll quickly show you the variation what you can do. When your opponent captures on knight takes on e4, you go rook e1. Definitely you would want to pin. Right? The knight cannot go back. He'll have to take a support. He cannot even defend with the queen because then you are giving a relative pin. You are pinning the queen. So let's say he places pawn to d5. If he places pawn to d5, attacking your bishop, protecting his knight, then you have this fantastic variation, a combination of move. You can first capture on d5. Don't think that you're losing the bishop. You're not. It's a temporary sacrifice. Because if the queen captures on the d5 square, then you are doing a dual pin there. You play a knight to c3. Now, knight is attacking the queen. The knight is also attacking the other knight. Both of these pieces can't move. The pawn cannot capture the knight over here because then it's a free queen. The queen is hanging there. The knight cannot capture the knight because it's an absolute pin. So here in this position, he will have to go back or he'll have to defend the queen. Let's say he goes with his queen to a5 square. If he moves his queen to a5, then you're simply going to win the knight. Capture the knight with your knight so that you have an option of giving a discovered check there. If your opponent tries to defend this check by playing bishop to e7 and preparing to castle on the next move, then in this whole Scotch Gambit thing, remember three things. You have to do capture, quick development, or checks. Captures, checks, and development. That's the whole idea. We are gambiting a pawn. We are sacrificing a pawn for the quick development in the game. Right. So let's say he plays his bishop to e7. Now you go and give an attack to this bishop. Play a bishop to g5. If by any chance your opponent does a mistake by capturing on the g5 square, thinking, okay, if the opponent recaptures, I'll play my bishop to e6 and defend the position, or go with the knight to e7 and defend the position, you don't need to capture the bishop on the g5 square directly. What instead you can do is an intermediate move. Do a discovered check, a double check. The knight is giving a check to the king and a discovered check from the rook to the king. The king needs to go to a safe square and defend the f7 square at the same time. If he plays his king to f8, then boom, rook to e8 is a checkmate, correct? Okay. And if he goes anywhere else, let's say the king goes to d8 square, then you have this fantastic knight f7, forking the king and the rook. Also, now the king is stuck in the center as he has already moved. So he cannot castle, right? So knight e4 fails to that particular line. What if after we castle, he's not playing his knight to e4, not capturing the pawn. Instead, he is playing his bishop to c5. If he plays his bishop to c5 over here, the idea remains the same. We are going to push our pawn to e5, attack the knight. Now, there are three options where the knight can go. Either the knight can go to g4, or he can counter attack by playing his pawn to d5. I'll quickly do the arrows. He can go to e4, he can go to g4, or he can give a counter attack by playing his pawn to d5. Let's have a look in all these three variations. First, let's start with knight moves on e4. Now, knight e4, you give an attack to this knight by playing your queen to e2. Now, knight has no good squares to go to and it will be trapped. So, knight to e4 is a dubious move. Do not do that. Your opponent most likely won't do it. Okay. So what about pawn to d5? Let's say he plays pawn to d5, giving a counter attack to your bishop. So if the pawn captures the knight, the pawn captures the bishop, but he fails to a certain variation. Now here you're going to capture on f6. Let's say he captures you on the c4 square, then you can immediately remember the three ideas that you have to do: checks, captures, and develop. Here, if you can capture, just go ahead with the capture. You are threatening to capture the rook on the next move. Let's say he defends the rook. The only option he has is to go on the g8 square. Then give a quick check. Rook to e1. He'll have to block it. He can block it with the knight or with the bishop. Let's say the bishop comes on the e6 square. Now, attack. Develop, attack. You can play a bishop to g5, attacking the queen. If the queen comes on d5 square, there is only one correct option. But 73% of the people, according to the database, the recent database, 73% of the people have fallen for this trap. They usually play their queen to d5. Now, what's the idea behind queen d5? It looks like they have solidified in the center. The center looks closed and the pieces are developed on the next move when they give an attack to your bishop. Let's say captures on the g7 square, gives an attack to your bishop. You can also aim for the long castle there. But this queen d5 fails to knight c3, taking the advantage that this is pin. If he captures your knight, then you're simply going to capture the queen because the bishop cannot retake it. Look at this rook, it is pinning the king. And if he is not capturing the knight, instead he is going with his queen to f5. Now, in that move, you wanted to play on knight to c3 with the idea to go knight e4 and knight f6. Give a check and most probably push this pawn up. Now, if he moves his queen to f5, you go with your knight to e4. You are attacking his bishop as well as you're aiming to go on the f6 square. Here, if he captures your pawn on the g7 square, then you're just okay. I would say the answer to this one. Let's do this as a quick puzzle for you guys. Pause the video over here, have a look at it. It is white to play. White is winning this in this position. How? You have to comment down your moves in the chat box here. Alright. So, queen d5 fails to that move. So what is the correct option? There's only one correct move. The correct answer is to play the bishop back on e7 square. So he has to defend the queen not by moving it to a safe square, but by going back on e7. Alright. So here, by going back on the e7 square. Here, if the bishop goes back on e7, you capture the bishop, trade the pieces, the queen will have to capture back. Next idea is for him to castle on the queen side. So remember, the bishop on the c5 square was doing a task of protecting the d4 pawn. Here you can go and capture the pawn on d4. If he trades it, then he is in loss because knight takes on d4, knight queen takes on d4. You are not allowing him to castle. The king will be stuck in the center, and you have a very good development. But instead, if he's not capturing and doing error and inaccuracy by castling on the queen side, then he fails to the idea that he's not pinning a knight. No, he is not doing that because you can capture on the c6 square with your knight, attacking his queen. If the rook captures the queen on the d1 square, then you capture his queen with a check. The king moves, you win the rook. He captures the knight, but you are materially up in that position, right? Although this pawn will be a very weak pawn there. Okay. So this was all when he places pawn to d5, right? We have seen what happens to knight e4. We have seen what happens to pawn d5. Now let's have a look what happens when he places knight to g4. Knight g4 looks a little standard move. Looks like he wants to give you an attack, trying to attack on the h7 square, attack the knight, and come with his queen to h4, aiming for a checkmate there. But in this, we can play our pawn to c3. If he captures, then you first capture on the f7 square with the bishop, give a check, the king captures it, queen to d5 with the same idea that this bishop is hanging. So you give a check. You have distracted his castling. He cannot castle anymore. He goes back. You win the bishop. He places pawn upon d6. You just captured it so that you want to open the files in the center. Next idea is to get the rook on the e1 square and will be attacking the king. You have to attack, you have to capture, you have to develop. That's what the whole thing you have to do in the Scotch Gambit. Alright. This was all about the Scotch Gambit. If you are one e4 player, then this should be in your bucket list. You should be able to know this gambit, and I'm 100% sure that you'll win a lot of games using this gambit. If you liked our content, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share with your chess friends. Thank you.